Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organisational transformation and on to changes in society and the world. My name is Andy Polaine. I'm a design leadership coach, service design and innovation consultant, educator and writer. My guest today is Kate Tarling, a service leader and specialist who helps large organisations create successful services by changing their working practices. She does this through consulting, training and writing, and regularly advises boards, executives and teams. She's managing director of a service consultancy she founded in 2012 and previously held senior leadership roles in government and the private sector. She's also author of the best-selling book, The Service Organisation. She's spoken about services, design and leadership at Harvard University, UCL, Google, the Estonian government, and the British Institute for Government. Kate, welcome to Power of 10.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So, first of all, the question I always start off with guests is, what's been your own journey to here? What did you initially start off doing or want to do? And how did you end up where you are now?
Early on, even while I was a student, I was somewhat interested in the internet and the very beginnings of it. And I was lucky enough to have a job coding links for one of the first sort of big company intranet sites. And I barely understood the World Wide Web at the time, but that set a bit of a precedent. And much of my sort of early career in my 20s was with sort of larger organizations that were somehow based on the internet. So telecoms firms, gaming firms, and then later on into consultancy. And I tended to look at all sorts of different areas. So I spent some time in marketing, in operations, and then began to be kind of interested in customer experience. And it was years until I had heard of a field of human-centered design or anything like that. And I think it was only coming together later on. So with that background of what it's like to be sort of very much running services, operating services, choosing how many people you needed in a customer service center, for example. I think that explains why I've always been interested in how large service organizations work and what makes it hard to do well.
It's charming that I started off coding links.
Yeah, it was literally hypertext markup language.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I was talking earlier today about this, actually, of those sort of very early days of thinking, oh, what does this all mean? And so, you talked about the organizational bit and obviously your book, which is very, very good. I really think, one of the things I still teach service design, and one of the things I often say to my students is, hey, if you're going to be complaining about the fact that the organization doesn't get it and stakeholders don't get it, and this is, why can't you just get on and do the design work and and do the service design, you're kind of in the wrong business, right? It's a bit like firefighters complaining that it's a bit smoky and they get burnt occasionally. It's part of the work. And I think mostly, and we'll get to this, I think most of the work is the organization wrangling, right? And so you do, the book is really fantastic for this, and it's very, very practical, but it's also got a lot of really nice mindset shifts and reframes in there that I think are very useful. Now, having said that, there is a part of this of organizational wrangling bit which is really teeth pulling. Like, to experience it is quite, it can be really kind of grinding. And I'm really interested to know what you obviously sort of, it makes your mouth water to kind of have those difficult or complex organizations to navigate. What is the attraction there for you to tackling that kind of hard bit of it?
Yeah, good question. I think it's partly comes from the difference between, you mentioned sort of service design there. And there's a real difference, isn't there, between using your skills and experience to design or improve services for people, and then the reality of that, which is getting your organization to do what's needed for that to happen. Because the two are sort of closely linked, but one can't happen without the other. And you're right, it's really hard sometimes. And I think you have to have an interest in diplomacy as well as sort of going after the the end result or the outcomes you're after. And so if you're very focused on sort of what you want to make happen, for me, it helps explain, well, these are simply tasks and activities and necessary things to do along the way in pursuit of that goal. But I also think it's really interesting. These are systems of people. I find people really interesting. Everybody's trying to do the right thing. No one sets out to try and make a bad organization or make a bad service. And so it's just inherently interesting. How do you kind of bring understanding that everyone's trying to do the right thing? Something isn't working about that. If you come in with the idea that, well, it's lucky I'm here because I've got all the answers, you've been doing this wrong until now, like, obviously none of us would like that. That's
the savior service designer.
Exactly. So I guess approaching it with understanding, diplomacy, trying to help people, work with people to get the right sort of things happening and done, for me is just inherently interesting and part of the work. And I can't sort of separate it in that way.
But when was the sort of moment where you realised that, but also where you realised you had a particular ability or insight into doing that kind of work?
I think for some of my career, I wasn't aware so much of the need for it, which is partly why I wanted to write a book to guide others to it. But there've probably been many points, but one in particular, I think I just completed a really interesting piece of work. We'd taken a sort of classic human-centered design process done, really interesting user research to find out all sorts of problems with the service. We had related those problems to costs, potential revenue opportunities. So had quite compelling business case for investing in improvement. And it just fell in a really sort of hard ground. It didn't match all the existing programs and portfolios that were already underway that sort of thought they were doing some of this rightly or wrongly. The leadership were so distant from the work. They didn't really kind of buy into the idea that you could make things easier for people and that would have a knock-on effect on operations. And so it was like, you can do the most impressive, useful piece of work, and it's not going to go anywhere unless you've got an understanding of the organization, how it works, how decision-making happens, where investment's currently being made. And if you can't make those links, it's too easy for you to get sidelined, whatever you're doing, however good it is.
And then the other bit of that question of like, when did you realize, I have a kind of a way of thinking about this, or an ability to do that kind of wrangling and getting that kind of buy-in? And or do you, I mean, I presume you feel that because you've written about it so well. Or is it still hard work?
Well, it's not easy for anybody. But certainly when you start to let go of the idea that the way that you think to approach work is the right way, and it's everybody else's fault for not thinking that way. And instead being like, okay, well, if somebody doesn't agree that this is useful, or they think they're already doing it, like sort of 50% trusting that they're right, 50% holding back for thinking about it. And so I think just at that point, starting to do that, say, okay, let's go and look at your program portfolio and find out what you are doing, why you think that you're doing it all really successfully anyway. So I think I don't know if it's a moment more than a sort of mindset of like, okay, I'm not going to assume that I'm right about this, even though it looks like I'm just coming with a bit of sort of humility.
Yeah. Did you have some sort of crashing and burning before that moment that sort of led you to that moment of humility?
Well, possibly inadvertently, but definitely noticed it in sort of the general zeitgeist of what was going on in terms of, the growth of sort of digital and design coming into organizations to transform people and it. And I think, although you do need a bit of a, right, we're going to do this differently, this is what's happening, and a bit of sort of power and motivation to make that happen. One of the downsides is that some people can feel othered by it.
Yeah.
And then if you're intent on changing the whole organization, it's really hard to do if you're coming at it as a separate unit, a separate team, or a separate person trying to drive that agenda. Yeah.
I mean, having worked for a consultancy and done a lot of that, I think, that's always the double-edged sword. Obviously, as consultancies, they have a usually a kind of broader range of experiences across industries. And even though every client would say, well, and of course we're different, they're kind of not really. Their industry is, but the problem they're having is often the same. And you have a bit more sort of license as a consultant to sort of come in and disrupt the kind of politics, if you like, a little bit. I think that is the problem, is that then A, you go again, and B, that othering, it's a nice way of putting it, it happens, and the organisational antibodies kick in, and then nothing goes anywhere.
And there are pros and cons of all approaches, aren't there? Time it takes, how widespread it is, what you get done. All of these are sort of variables depending on the approach you take.
Well, that's what I was just about to say about the time thing. I think it's unlike a thing where it's maybe, make us a website, make us an app or whatever. And obviously those things then have longer lifespans, but there's a sort of clear deliverable. It could be build and implement our new SAP system. There's still a sort of clear moment of delivered and done and kind of there, I think. And, and it's usually a, relatively short time frame, 3, 6, 12 months or something. Whereas, I don't know about you, but I've worked on service design projects where from, the moment of the very first sort of workshop to kick things off to, and to even just start the research to a pilot going out, to maybe a few hundred people was 2 years. And actually, there's some things that I've worked on in Australia where, 5 years later, someone got in touch and said, oh, we've just gone out of pilot and we're live with this thing, because it was a very big and complex project. And that is, in the sort of quarterly cycle, particularly of consulting, in the kind of rapid cycling of that's just an age. But even internally with the organizations who are still caught in those cycles, that's just such a kind of long view that I think the organization struggles to sort of grapple with that as a sort of unit of time.
It always feels like you can do sort of work at different levels almost simultaneously, can't you? Even if you're working on, I've worked on some pretty enormous, complex public services in my time, but trying to break down how to work on something so that you can be learning, delivering something, iterating, changing, testing within those shorter time frames feels like the only kind of safe way to approach the reality of complexity at scale, what's sort of building on from it. But the thing that inevitably takes time is wider kind of cultural shifts around that the rest of the organization might take, like how they look at how governance works or how they handle sort of reporting cycles as part of the corporate activity, or like how funding works. Like those are much bigger changes, or just on a personal level, how we think about our role there. Like that takes time. And again, it really helps if people have some specific experience of how those things could work differently.
Yeah.
But the reality is, particularly on big services and big organizations like this, it can take months and years to have profound shifts, but you can always do things within the week, month, quarters as well, I think.
Yeah, there's a kind of fractal nature to that, I think, where you can there's the big thing and then you zoom in and there's another thing and then you just keep zooming in, and each thing is sort of complex in its own right. And the worst bit is obviously that everything's connected to everything else in that very sort of ecosystem sense of things. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so hard, because the organization, particularly if they're coming from much more of a sort of project management, sort of industrial setup, which is what most organizations still are stuck in. Their desire, the sort of natural habit is, let's break this down into smaller chunks and disconnect them from each other so we can work on each bit. And of course, then that moment of disconnection is when it all starts to fall apart. I'm interested, I want to ask you sort of an author's question, actually. One of the things, because of that fractal nature of things, one of the things that we struggled when we were writing our book on service design was like, in what order you tell this story, because a book is a linear medium, and what's the right chapter structure. And we at one point we kind of printed everything out and put it all up on the wall and kind of in this very room, actually, and so moved it all around because we thought, well, this isn't quite working. And reading your book, I was struck by, you could kind of read your book backwards and equally as forwards, because your final chapter is about sort of making better services, the organization strategy, and I think the chapter before is about governance, or support from people at the top and that kind of stuff. And the beginning is about this idea of redefining your service, from the outside. in, you know, you kind of need both of those, right? The impetus could come from either way. And I'm wondering, just was that clear, the structure of this, or was that something you also struggled with when you were writing?
Oh yeah, it's really hard writing a book, isn't it?
Yeah.
It most definitely was not obvious how to structure a book like this. But there were a few principles that I was trying to use. So one is that this is complex stuff. I don't know that any one organization would do everything all at once or have the capacity to. So I wanted to make a book that you could pick up and read the chapter. So, you know, if service leadership and ownership is a particular theme, as it is with many organizations right now, that you could dive in and look at that chapter or reread it or pick the page that was the most helpful and share it with someone else. For that, you didn't necessarily need the whole background. That said, I think the overall is, if you find yourself inside a large organization and your goal, your remit, or your desire is to help make it a better service organization, what are some of the natural steps you might take? And you sort of hit the nail on the head here. I don't think you can do like just demonstrating by making one better service or one better product. I don't think the rest of the organization is magically going to look at that and go, oh, okay, brilliant. We think we need to work really differently now to make that happen everywhere. We've got it. That doesn't happen by itself. But neither, if you remain talking in abstract with leadership, it's really hard for them to kind of see for themselves what it looks like when you're working differently. So to do the two together. So the book starts with, okay, you're inside an organization. Here's some of how you might start at a practical level. What's useful, bringing a bit of order to what's often chaos, or bringing a narrative about what are we doing the same that might be common that we could probably handle more sensibly across an organization. And then expanding out from there. So hang on, have we actually got a strategy for all these different services we're operating? How might decision-making happen? And what about the teams that we need? So it can kind of grow from there. But it's, trying to handle two things at once.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, the book starts with this idea of redefining your organization. So in that sense, I guess the beginning sort of meets the end. Like it does connect back around again, if you see it as a cycle, but it's a redefining your organization by the service it provides. And then you kind of talk about this idea of, you know, defining what a service is from the outside in. Can you talk about those two things? Because they sort of come together.
Yeah. And it's a sort of interesting concept because in some ways, the only things under your control are what's happening on the inside, because you can't dictate what someone does with their lives or with your product or so on. It's just that it's so often like institutions and large organizations kind of forget to make the link, or it just becomes really hard or overwhelming, or you're too tired, or there's too many priorities going on. So it can become really easy to just be focused on the projects, the portfolios, that large piece of technology reform that's happening, or the pressures on our operational teams. So the idea is to be able to lift out of that, to have some connecting force that sits above that helps you make sense of what is under your control. And that's to see or to redefine what performance means in terms of what's happening in the outside world. And that is everything from what your users know of you or think of you, what they can do, what they can't do, how easy it is, and so on. But it also incorporates kind of your business goals and your drivers, like why are you doing this in the first place? Is it to make money? Is it to manage costs? And then the wider remit, the wider intent from public service, that might be to do with the policy outcome. But otherwise it's to do with the mission of the organization, why it exists. And sort of bringing that together, defining that as good performance, and it sort of brings a sense of, right, this is why we're doing all that we're doing on the inside. So when I'm thinking about how well it's working, the actual activities we need, I've got something to look for, something that brings it all together.
There's a phrase you use more than once actually in the book, which is this idea of start before you have permission, which I really like. There's a kind of slightly sort of guerrilla aspect to that. Why is that necessary?
Thinking in terms of services that intentionally cut and realistically cut across every area of an organization, particularly the older, larger organizations that are often structured functionally, goes against everything that people think that they're doing, that the structure's based on, that our assumptions are based on. So it's fairly unlikely. And often the problems of that are quite hidden because we report on delivery or things being shipped. We don't report on sort of how well those things work together for the good of the whole. So it kind of goes against everything. So it's unlikely that someone is saying, do you know what, Kate, could you come in and reorient us around services off the bat? And that's true. I used to think that if you want to make big changes in an organization, what you need to do is basically get as high as you possibly can. So if you're the chief executive or the CEO, then you're in a position to be able to do these things for the organization. So that was part of my plan.
Yeah.
But I began to realize that's not true either, because there's always people around you that will have different opinions, won't necessarily see things the same way, have different incentives and motivations. So if you've got a board structure, a board of directors that are all structured around individual functions, it might not necessarily be a compelling goal to reorient that around end-to-end services. So realizing, the CEO will come under pressure from the chief finance officer or the board or the chairperson of the board or somebody else. So whatever role you are at, I think you just have to start, if you can see value, if you can see that it makes sense, whether you're an individual who's just joined an organization, whether you're a service designer, whether you're an operational manager, whether you're the chief executive, just starting and then learning and then being able to change course or redirect accordingly seems like the best strategy.
Yeah. And you talk about a lot of strategies like this of, sometimes if you don't have all the data, to just get started with your best guesses at this, and then you can kind of go back and get that data, or you mapping out the service and showing people it, so that once they see it, they have that moment. Oh yeah, okay. Now we sort of get it. There's a quite an element of show don't tell there, I think, in that idea of start before you have permission, because sort of by default, I guess, or de facto, if the organisation is undertaking this process, or if you're there, they have problems, right? If they knew all of this stuff up front, they would have done it. You would imagine. And I guess so that's part of the thing, is to give the diagnosis for people to look at the very beginning. There's a tension or potential tension there, though, because on the one hand, I think that can be very powerful to say, like, I've done the work of kind of mapping out all the bits of this, how this all hangs together as an entire ecosystem, and you can see now where it's not matching up, or where kind of a typical thing as some backstage problem appears, so some back end system issue or process issue appears later on as a fail point for the customer or end user. And previously, because there's been in separate departments or whatever, they haven't been connected, that chain hasn't been connected together. So that can be really useful, because at this moment of now we see it all together, and now that gives us greater insight of how we're all working together and collaborating. The other side of that is that can also tread on people's toes, right?
Yeah.
So how do you gauge that, do you think?
And at the heart of it is it often can mean a shift in power dynamics, or challenging the notion of that an organization is there and that you are allowed to kind of own a bit of the operation or a bit of it, rather than you're there working together for the goals of the organization and on behalf of who it's there to serve. So it does challenge some people's, I think, notions of what they're doing and sort of what their entitlement is at certain points in their career.
Yeah. And their status and expertise, right?
Yeah, particularly can be status. I think what's really important is that this sort of move to thinking about services which cut across and bring some of those things to bear is not meant to be sort of an idea that you're forcing upon people in sort of some dogmatic way. It's meant to be valuable and useful and serve the goals of the organisation, the goals of the people that rely on services better. So that can sometimes help to provide some objectivity and sort of logic to follow that makes it easier to talk about, well, what are the activities we need? What are the roles we need? Does it make sense that you own the area versus seeing your role very much working with and supporting the other areas to do better? So there isn't so much of, blame for one area not working very well. Like take much more of a kind of shared responsibility and accountability of working together for the good of the whole. So at the very core, it starts to shift some perceptions about what we're here to do, I think.
Yeah. One of the ways you talk about doing this is one of the chapters is called Reveal How Services Perform in the Real World. And I wonder if you found that useful to take the focus of your bit isn't working and the sort of naming and shaming, because I think people can feel called out by when you sort of map it out and it's like, this bit isn't working. And then they will resist the change or they'll be defensive and so forth, which is a natural human reaction.
Yeah.
But part of your thing is to really look at, what's the job of the service and its outcomes and the classic what good looks like and what the indicators are for that, but from the outside. Have you found that is a useful way to sort of take the focus off the sort of internal politics and kind of slight navel gazing to look at it out an external thing?
Yeah, it's definitely one good way that can work to kind of bring some objectivity to it, and just to get. Sometimes it's about as much as about landing kind of agreement, like shared agreement between areas that this is all what we're trying to make happen, isn't it? And it's really easy for that sort of culture of blame to exist, like whether it's the IT department or the operational team or the digital team or somebody else. But yeah, if you can kind of define performance in terms of like either words or numbers, and then sort of check in with each other saying, this feels like what we're aiming for, right? Like to carefully. And there will be all sorts of reasons why people find that hard, or, perhaps I don't get the thing I need from this other area or this other team, or it's really hard for me to know what to do when this sort of thing happens. But it can help kind of connect, like be a practical way to help connect, or also to bring in support from leadership as well, if needed. So sometimes it doesn't happen naturally because people are incentivized differently.
Yeah.
But in that case, it can help you get support for that process as well.
What I was going to say is it's funny, isn't it? Because that thing of everyone blaming everyone else just goes to show how everything's connected to everything else. Actually, kind of the sort of casting blame around the place that everyone else is a sign. It maps out the system actually, or the ecosystem. That's it's funny.
It's a fun little exercise, like mapping the blame.
I want to talk about the unit of teams. You talk about this, and I thought it was kind of really interesting. There's a little quote. You said, "What is a team if working across the whole service requires the combined expertise of operations, user researchers, product managers, developers, designers, policy and strategy, not to mention legal, commercial, procurement, finance, fraud, and compliance?" We have this two default things, which is projects to chunk down work and teams to sort of be the container of people. But you kind of talk about this as that's actually kind of part of the problem in some respects. Tell me a little bit about your view on the kind of the unit of the team and how it might be, they might sort of work together or be considered differently.
And I think I've changed my view over time. So there's been a brilliant shift to thinking in terms of multidisciplinary teams, hasn't there? So you don't have your designers separate from your developers, and they're separate from the product managers or so on. You try to bring people together and have them work together. It's just that when we work on really complex services, that might be part of the answer for the sort of digital parts of a service. But what about the underlying infrastructure, or what happens in the contact centers, or for the people making decisions behind the scenes who might, be given really rubbish tools to work with? So it's partly like challenging the notion that a multidisciplinary team only means some disciplines because of how interconnected it is. But in order to make it workable, you have to have smaller groups of people working together. So rather than split by disciplines, there's an interesting split, which is more about what that team is trying to make happen. And how it's been used in some organizations is by focusing some teams on operating a service, but including the skills and experience to be able to make changes, not separating the two. And other teams are working on changing parts of a service, and their entire emphasis is on, testing, learning, what might improve in performance. But you also need operational people or policy people alongside you doing that. So to change the nature of a team around what it's there to do, the activity it's trying to get done, rather than into disciplines or groups or tribes.
Yeah, so you have these service teams, depth teams, common capability teams, enabling teams, coordinating teams, and what's the other one? Organising teams. I think I'm cribbing off of the book right now. Yeah, operational teams. Yeah, that's right. What you just said. Yeah,
there are some that focused on running or operating, and some that are kind of sitting around that. And I think for some people that's like quite a lot of types of teams. I think that is the reality in very large organisations, that you have people doing those. It's part of an answer to probably like things that just don't work that well otherwise.
So with those different teams, a very common thing, particularly in larger organisations, but and it's funny how we keep saying in larger organisations. And when I think back, as a consultant, a lot of large enterprises say, treat us like a startup, or we want to start a kind of innovation unit that's like a startup within our company. And there's a sort of tacit recognition that the way we work now is broken. So can we do something else? And when I kind of think back of like, what would that mean, to be a startup, is that you'd strip away a lot of policy and process and sort of craft around it. Because a startup has, you might be 2 people, it might be, 10 people, and often people wearing the same hat. So often one of the founders is both the CEO and the sort of head of marketing or something. So there's no conversation to be had there between them. Or if then the head of product or head of engineering is the other founder, then they just have a conversation with each other because they're having that anyway. So the lines of communication are much, much shorter. But also they're obviously way more nimble. They don't have procurement departments. They can choose whatever tools make sense, at the time, because they just, put them on their credit card or whatever, all of that kind of stuff. And it's interesting when you kind of strip it all out, it's kind of everything that makes a large enterprise, right? You just take all of that away, and then you have sort of a small group of people who communicate well with each other and are able to be sort of fleet of foot and flexible and sort of discover as they go. One of the things that then starts to happen in a larger org with teams is this idea of owning stuff. And we talked about it a little bit before. How do you prevent this situation where you go, okay, we're going to think differently about how we structure teams, and they're going to be, around what they're focusing on rather than their disciplines. How do you stop that turning into just another version of the same thing where now they're sniping at each other and trying to kind of gain ownership?
Yeah, good question. And I think if you sort of got a range of starting approaches to this, so if you're in the lucky and enviable position of starting what will likely be a big service, but you can start from scratch, actually like never starting with all those different kinds of teams at once. Like trying to start with one team and then using that one team to seed and grow other teams so that you can have people get to know each other, know ways of working. And it's much easier to have that kind of shared sense of ultimately what's needed by growing that way. The problem is it's like that isn't how it happens in every situation. Like you're often a service might be running for like dozens or even hundreds of years, and you're kind of in the middle of it and there's all sorts of teams already. I think it's not necessarily a given that this doesn't automatically mean that silos don't start forming. I think how you pull in working practices around this is really important. So making sure that that the teams do feel cohesive, that they've at least got a shared view of what they're ultimately trying to pull together, that you've got a rhythm of how you work together. So what kind of, weekly or monthly interactions do teams have? Like a chance for everybody to come together and talk about the changes that are happening, why they're happening, what we're going to learn, what we want to look out for. And so it's not, the team structure by itself does not prevent new silos from forming, but how you think about, well, what practices do we need so that we feel like a whole working for the whole? Okay, well, let's try every Wednesday morning, we're going to do this thing. On a Monday, we're going to have this thing, and this is how we'll know, and we can see how that works for a few months, and then we'll make changes if we don't feel like we're all pulling together then. There's a whole sort of other working practices that you probably want to look at the same time to help prevent that natural movement. Whenever you have groups of humans, it can happen.
I wonder if there's a discipline stoush that goes, I think it's an Australian word, isn't it? Stoush argument that goes on there. I often rail, you and I are friends with quite a lot of well-known product people, and I often sort of rail at the product community that most of them, if not all of them, are actually working on creating services. And our mutual friend Jeff Gothelf, I was very happy to see his quote on the back of your book, where it says, Kate finally puts to bed the "is it a product or a service" debate by proving that all organisations are service organisations. So it's there on record, Jeff. My complaint usually about the kind of product thing is that product has risen. It's done great things, right? And it's been a discipline that's really kind of grown in the last sort of 15 years or so. But there's also been a bit of a sort of ownership pull towards product managers and heads of product and so forth, as we are the Steve Jobses of the organisation and kind of the masterminds. And I guess I'm talking about when it's done badly, like Teresa Torres and Melissa Perry were kind of rolling their eyes at this, saying, yeah, but when it's done well, it's a collaborative thing, which it is. But I think there are two different mindsets that go on there. And hearing you talk about those different kinds of cadences and rituals and how we work together, I can also think of all the kind of product and lean approaches and agile approaches that will say, well, we already do all of that. So, kind of what's the difference, and how do you sort of marry this view that you're talking about here together with that very loud voice that product has inside organizations at the moment?
And I think you do need somebody with a sort of guiding voice, because there's so many influences coming at you, coming at teams otherwise. So you need someone who, great if they happen to know all the right answers, who wouldn't want that? It's just that we don't believe that can be true all the time across the board. So someone who can kind of corral the various influences coming in and help to make sense of them. Or who can do a really good job at communicating what's going on so that everybody else is in a better position to make decisions for themselves. So there's lots of that kind of leadership role. It might well be a head of product or a product person. It might be an operational person. It probably depends on somewhat the nature of the organization and the extent of knowledge that they have as well. So I think definitely there is room for leadership. And if it's small and teams can do it for themselves, great. I don't think at scale that's realistic. I think underpinning the wider conversation about, well, hang on, isn't this what kind of agile means? They're often thinking in terms of, building software, building pieces of technology, not necessarily how do you run we've got a frontline team of 10,000 people running a service day to day. What about them? Where's the sort of the feedback loop, the learning, the tools, the sort of thinking about how this all fits together. And I think really we're saying, I think some things are more certain than others. Where you have uncertainty, you put certain skill sets together who can kind of build, try, test, learn, iterate together. Where things have more certainty, or they're more predictable day to day, you might have different forms of teams. It doesn't mean that there's sort of one size fits all. You either can't know anything and have to learn everything, or you can know everything, predefine everything up front. Neither of those are true.
No.
But there are sort of some situations where some works more than others. So I think it's a sort of a maturing, a reality, an acknowledgement of scale that brings some of these thoughts and thinking together.
What this all points to is actually the last kind of 2 or 3 chapters of your book around that, strategy really, and having a clarity around that from above and the governance and support from the top. And I think, when I see, when I'm complaining about sort of bad product going on, if you like, or product management skills going on, it often, I get it a lot in my coaching, because I'm coaching design leaders who are finding it are frustrated often by the things they're being asked to do, or they feel they're being dictated to and so forth, and don't have the voice. Their experience isn't being drawn upon and leveraged as in the way it could be. It's very hard to kind of change things entirely from the bottom, because a lot of it has to come from the top. But, one of the ways of doing it is to ask lots of pointy questions. You're like, why are we doing this? And how does this fit with our strategy? And what would good look like? And you soon find out that, well, at least certainly in those problem cases, it ladders up to there really isn't a clarity of vision or strategy right at the top. And in fact, leadership are often asking people much further down to sort of define that. And I had one coach there, kind of co-founder and CPO, is like, I want your, what's the strategy, the design strategy for the next, 18 months. And it's like, yeah, but what's the product strategy? You don't really have one. And so they're actually kind of hoping it's going to come from the bottom, because they don't have it themselves at the top. And that's a bit of a
Yes.
disaster. But it's kind of common. It's particularly common, as you said, in sort of larger, older organizations too.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because in some ways, how brilliant to bring the people who are ideally kind of closest to what's actually happening, what customers and users are doing, to help define what we should be doing that would be better. But if the result of that is completely different steers, lack of vision, no prioritization, that's the sort of the bad edge of the blade. And I think like there are things you can do in that situation, aren't there, to help to make those logical arguments and links between things, and then calling out the consequences of a different steer. But I think it's really important to hold a vision, I think, in as a leadership activity. And that could be a single person as a leader. It could be like a number of people across the team too. Otherwise it is really difficult to know what to not do.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, I mean, there's a few kind of things that happen certainly in that sort of startup and scale-up world, where the people who are quite good at starting a startup and that entrepreneurial aspect, and they can get their first few rounds of funding, they're not very good at dealing with it when the organization gets bigger. And sometimes they just get bored, I think, of it and sort of slightly check out. And so they don't have a kind of purpose beyond the next few years. And then once they've got there, it's like, no, now the party has started, not really sure, not really sure how this continues or ends, or I'm not interested anymore. Here's another new shiny thing. I'd be interested in your view. You obviously work with quite a lot of government and public services. There you get this tension between policy from a governmental political level and what the organization might feel it should be doing, and how you navigate that.
I think part of this sort of notion of multidisciplinary comes in very much because it's sort of shifting the idea that policy is made in complete abstract and isolation and then thrown over the wall to be implemented. And so much work, particularly in the UK government, in many governments, has been about trying to move away from that position to be much more learning what works, being able to change course, deliberately leaving gaps in policy so that we can learn much, much closer to implementation. So there's definitely been sort of some shifts. It's also true, just as it is in the private sector, though, there's an awful lot of change and investment happening without a prime directive from a new policy. Enormous technology reform taking place, or some other particular campaign happening. So it can be a driver, but there's an awful lot, even in public sector, where policy isn't the driver, it's something else. Is like a lot of money is being invested. Can we make sure that we are spending it in the best way for the best value, given what we're trying to achieve overall?
Yeah. I mean, you give some really good examples of how some things require a change of policy to really unlock the way you work. Like, and sometimes it's the things we're asking of people, and we think this is a risk thing. And there was a thing about people with newborns having to, can you just give that anecdote about them constantly having to reprove?
Yes, there was a new bit of policy, and this is often the case, talking about when governments give support to people, and they've got particularly eligibility criteria about who gets the support, because they want the financial support to be in the hands of the people who need it most. So you have these criteria. But then there's a concern, well, what if someone no longer meets the criteria, but we're still giving them money, and that means someone else might not be getting the money? And in this one example, it was looking at people and how much support they would need for children. And they were expecting that people would sort of reapply for this on a weekly basis. But it would mean like you're having to constantly demonstrate that you've had a newborn and you've still got a newborn. It's like, what is the point of that? Like, there are some things that we can know once.
Yeah.
We don't need to keep checking.
And I think you said, what is it that you're trying to prevent here? And it's a really good question, I think, on that. It's particularly around risk and things. And you also then went on to say there's quite a lot of stuff you can do and transformation that can actually happen with inside existing policy. I think policy often gets pointed to as the bugbear of kind of, oh yeah, we can't do that because policy. And actually it also really revisits the actual policy itself. It's usually how policy has then been implemented in the organization, but the original policy, and even more the intent behind that policy. And when you go back there, you really open up the opportunity space to change things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it requires, a bit of archaeology.
Yeah.
as to where
Yeah.
notions or thoughts come from.
I know, and there's hundreds
yeah.
of policies laid down over the years, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not, it just is where sort of things get a bit muddied up between saying how something is done in reality and practice, that doesn't leave room to kind of learn, change, or even like respond to the fact that, well, the internet's here now and we're in the digital era, like things can and should probably work differently. And there are new risks to think about as well.
Yeah.
So it's a more sort of trying to get to a more adaptive position for organizations to be in.
One day we had a workshop with a large, at the beginning of this project I was talking about, actually, that went, unfolded over many years. And because this kept happening, we got the policy people in the room in one of the workshops. And, that comment happened a lot of, oh, yeah, no, well, that's not possible because policy doesn't allow it. And the policy guy was like, that's not true. He was like, not true. And it's he kept having to pipe up and go, no, that's not true. That's just that's the way this organization has interpreted policy, but that's in fact not the case.
There's something about, like, it's so easy to do, to accidentally block really sensible, different takes on things, like because you think you kind of know stuff, or because you're, there's the whole view about, we should, that might be a bit risky. We want to, err on the side of caution. Everyone, like, oh yeah, that's true. Like, it's so easy to dampen down attempts at rethinking. It takes real calling out, and the consequences of not doing something differently are often not held in equal. Which you also need to do a good job of.
I mean, I've often had in a workshop, literally, so people shutting down an idea and saying, that's too risky, we can't do that, or it's a PR problem or whatever. And I'm like, I'm holding a Post-it note in my hand and said, this is just a stick man and a couple of words on a Post-it note. This hasn't gone out into the world yet, and I've sort of crunch it up and we can throw it away. It's not yet a thing, and I do think that's one of design's superpowers, actually. And I say this really often, but this idea of the ability to make an idea more tangible, whether it's in a little sketch or a storyboard, or, sometimes it's some kind of mapping thing or a concept, so that the fear that is kind of building up of when I project that in my mind of my idea of what that thing would look like when I look at that idea on a Post-it note and it's horrific and terrifying, versus, oh, now I see it, now I've seen how that would actually work, and seeing it as a tangible thing, it's far less scary quite often. And even if it isn't less scary, you actually have a thing, you're all looking at the same thing, and it's a fantastic alignment ability, and the fact that designers can do that, and actually help everyone else do that too, because it's not, everyone can do a stick man drawing. It's incredibly powerful. And I think we sort of forget that that's a thing that we can do quite often.
Absolutely. And it helps to de-risk it, doesn't it? Like, there are probably ways, like if you're concerned about a PR disaster, what's the smallest way of trying and seeing and limiting that risk when you might learn what the benefits are that make you think, actually, this is the right course of action. And by being able to visualize it, you put people in a much better position to be able to logically think through some of the implications and consequences and how you might learn about it safely, which is really powerful.
Which sort of brings us towards the end of your book. You talk about, obviously support from people at the top, but also this idea of, revolutionizing governance. So not government, but governance. And you started it with, you used to find governance was really tedious. But actually, there's, you go on to talk about this thing of, there are conversations that are happening at certain points, including in those kinds of workshops or meetings, as they probably are, that are important. Can you tell me why governance is interesting and important?
I think sometimes it's used as a word to be a sort of scapegoat that's come to mean everything that's dysfunctional about an organization, isn't it? Oh, it's the governance is like the reason why things are so hard. It was helpful for me to just unpack, what do we mean by governance? What are some of the things that happen that we think of as governance? And it's decision making, like how decisions are made, how close people are to the work, and the process of scrutiny and challenge and power and influence and all of those things. If you care about making real stuff happen in the world to have real impact, like, you have to then be interested in those things, because as I learned, a good process by itself does not lead to anything changing unless you can play enough of the game and understand enough about how your organization operates. So for me, it should be at the sort of cutting edge of where we think our work should be. And all sorts of people are missing in those conversations at the moment. People who really get what's happening, people who do have a really good, strong, nuanced view of the work, people who are close to the reality of customers and users, people who are implementers. The problem, like by showing up and being part of those forums, even to help you just begin to understand how your organization is operating, you can kind of go away then and think about whether it's relevant, whether you want to pursue it or not, but just to get an understanding about how decisions are being made and how work gets progressed or stopped or invested in is really powerful knowledge to have that you can bring to bear in your own work.
Yeah, it is really, really important. I think this is one thing that, very good or sometimes nefarious politicians know is, what committee do I need to be on? Where is the decision going to be made? And, they either use it to get something through the cracks and they know how to kind of, get something through the system, or they use it to block, obviously, as well, when they're doing it badly. And Lisa Welchman, who wrote a book called Managing Chaos, and it's called the sort of tagline is Digital Governance by Design. She was on the podcast ages ago, and she really opened up my eyes to this, actually, to this idea of, those kinds of conversations you're talking about. And one of them things she said is, this stuff you really need to set up early, particularly in startups, because, as it expands, it's never going to get simpler and you're never going to get less busy, right? So that, if you don't do it early on, you end up with like a sort of governance debt later on, because it then becomes really hard because practices have become established and ways of working and sort of tacit informal power structures are in there, and it's not that's much harder and messy to navigate.
And and very much is the realm within large organizations because it already exists that way. And a little bit like we were saying, the difference between kind of leadership in terms of owning and status versus guardianship and collaboration. There's a similar thing in terms of, I think, sort of presence in some of those decision-making forums can be given as a reward, or be seen as some sort of status. And that's, one sign when you've got committees that have like dozens and dozens of people. You've got like a decision-making forum of 25 people that comes together once every 3 months, whereas, the cadence of the work is happening daily. It's like, that's something else. That's not a decision-making forum. That's a probably really important communications engagement forum. Yeah, or a club, worst case. But being very clear about how decision-making happens and the need for communications engagement, like respectful collaboration, informing and so on, they're all good, but they're not the same thing. And to pretend they are is inviting all sorts of dysfunction and delay in good work being done.
Yeah, I don't know if you've watched any of Succession, the series.
I have.
And sometimes I've been watching that, and cringing terribly because it's felt like a documentary, of some of the places I've worked at. But you see there, I mean, what's sort of cringeworthy and so fascinating about it is you really do see two things which I think do go on all the time. One is, who's in the conversation, who's not, and everyone kind of vying to try and be in a conversation or exclude others from a conversation, but also that lack of candor, of people kind of half saying things and maybe not, just to test out, which side is this person on, and I'm going to kind of, just constantly leaving ambiguity there about what their position is. And so, and it creates this very kind of toxic environment. And the more that people can feel like they can be open and clear, and, there's a equity there in what people are saying to each other, the better. So listen, we could talk about this for ages and ages, but we're coming up to time. My last question is always based on, so the Power of 10 podcast is based on, is named after the Eames film, which is called Powers of 10, which is about the relative size of things in the universe to each other. And you can talk about that sort of ecosystem view, these different zoom levels. You see a lot of patterns repeating. It's really fascinating, from out in the universe all the way down to sort of subatomic levels. And so the final question is, what one small thing could be redesigned or is overlooked maybe that has an outsized effect on the world?
This is at risk of sounding a bit cliched, I think. But if ultimately the thing we can control is mostly ourselves, I think how we approach other people and to really focus on kindness and assertiveness as a mode of being. And I say that because knowing that the people that would probably things would benefit from most if they were are the least likely to pay attention. So, there's that. But I think at an individual level, how one shows up with others has a really sort of outsized impact in our organizations.
I don't think it's a cliche at all. That's a very fine answer indeed. Where can people find you online? Where do you hang out on the interwebs?
Well, these days, LinkedIn increasingly. Mm-hmm. But LinkedIn, Twitter, there's a website, theserviceorg.com, and I blog at katetarling.com and other places on the internet.
Great. I shall put them all in the show notes. Thank you so much for being my guest on Power of 10.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
You've been listening to me, Andy Polaine, on Power of 10. You can find me at apolaine on pkm.social, on Mastodon, apolaine on Twitter, or go to polaine.com, where you can find more episodes, check out my coaching practice and online courses, as well as sign up for my newsletter, Doctor's Note. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to give it a rating on iTunes. As you know, it tickles the algorithms and helps more people find the podcast. As always, get in touch if you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions for guests. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.